The struggle really started when I was a child. I don't know of anyone who really had the problems that I have had. Well, I'd say as an individual. Of course, this is natural to think that each of us must have the greatest of all problems. But you must remember that I had practically every disease that could have been known to a child in order to get out of this body as the child tried to fight it all the way through. Actually, I had pleurisy so bad at one time when I got to be about 3 that I had to learn to talk all over again. And for many years, I had lips in my voice. Even as an adult, I couldn't pronounce the L's right, and I had to overcome this in order to do public speaking. Now, there are many things that I had to do, and it can't go all the way back into the lifetime before this, in which I was born in the Caucasian Mountains and had to go through a series of trainings there, even to the extent of keeping myself inside. Let me put it like this. I was walled in a place in which I had to stay for 50 days. And within that 50 days, there was no light, nothing. Just a small amount of food was put in there twice a day for eating. Then I was trained in order to eventually come into this position as living egg master. Now you must remember, as I have always said before, those who gain mastership are always chosen by the egg, or say, the Sugman. And the egg acts as a vehicle, and the egg concentrates itself in the one individual who becomes the master. And believe me, from the time that he's selected from childhood up to the time of the birth of a true consciousness, of the full consciousness, he really has a terrible struggle. His struggle is not only financial, but it's spiritual and emotional, because he is so highly sensitive to everything around him. He can't work in commercial work because he's too sensitive. He has to learn certain things to move along in life, or had to work in a certain amount of commercialism and business and that sort of thing. But at the same time, he has to be himself in this other world. I suppose that I was really the worst of rebels you ever found, and I was paying for it because of my attitude towards the state-owned society, or the establishment, which you'd call it. There's a lot of things that I did in those days, which when I look back on them, I have to have a long laugh about it. As I was talking to a friend in Seattle not long ago who worked for one of the major newspapers where I was working there too, and we laughed over something that would be of interest today to you. And one was that I had so many caps in those days that I could wear a new cap for 60 days. I was working for the advertising department there, on this newspaper. And I put up an argument with one fellow one day and laid down a $10 bet that I could wear a new hat for every day for the next 2 months. And he bet that I couldn't. So about 20 days after appearing in the office with new cap on every morning, it began to create quite an excitement for everybody. So I was called in before the advertising manager and stood on the carpet and told I had to get rid of those hats. And this fellow didn't like me in the first place. And I told him wearing hats was my own business and that he had nothing to do with it. And he says, well, you won't wear them to work here. And I replied, I'll wear them any place that I please, regardless of who says what. And that didn't suit him fine, so then he set out to get me fired. But he couldn't get me fired because I was then under a different department of his. Although he had a big department all of his own, he was not completely over all of us because he was only what they call the display advertising man. And the advertising man, who was over all of it, heard the story from him and the complaint about me and told him that he wanted me fired. Well, I got along pretty good with the advertising manager, and he just slipped me some under the table advice. He said, oh, don't stir up any more hornets. Just wear your regular little hat every day that you want to wear, or your little cap you want to wear to work, and don't get any more hornets stirred up. And I said, okay, I'll take it like that, and then promptly went off and forgot about my hats. But he hadn't forgotten about it, and eventually, in the long run, with added in 2 or 3 other things, he had his way about me getting out of his hair. Well, most of these things that I did were actually pranks and just whimsical little things I did to stab those people who had swollen heads and who were very unhappy about me being in their way. Like this. I did a lot of button pushing and did a lot of things there that people didn't like, and they all felt it was funny. And I was actually playing pranks on the whole organization, and this is the way that I actually been all my life with the establishment. I just kept punching holes here and there where they would feel my punches, and yet sometimes they were so subtle that they couldn't be seen, and sometimes they were just so big that hit them on the head with it. I paid for all of these things, and yet in a way this is a part of the struggle and part of its training that I had, that I couldn't live in society, and yet I couldn't be with it. I spent a lot of time walking the seashores, trying to adjust myself to living like the ordinary person lives, but I couldn't do it. The main thing came down to the point that nobody ever wanted me, and they could sense this freedom and independence in me that was much greater than they had seen in other people, and yet then they weren't interested anymore from that time on that I would do them any good. In other words, as long as I could serve them and bring them in $1 or $2, they could use me and pay me starvation wages, and that I didn't like. I thought I was as good as the next fellow, and I figured out then that I would be the fellow who could outshine anybody else if they wanted to do something for me. But they never wanted to do anything. They always wanted to give me the worst end of everything, and yet themselves, they wanted to make money off my labor. So I said, I can't work this way, and I went into writing, and eventually I became a writer. And eventually this writing was helping me because the writer that I am today. Going back to my youth, of course, the development in my early youth, I was very interested in watching, going back now, and watching some of this development. Let me give you a very simple story. After I had the problem of pleurisy, the speech impediment that I spoke about a while ago, I was around the age of 3 at the time, and I've written on several occasions how my stepsister had saved my life at this time. While recovering, I used to go out on the porch during the spring and sit down in a lotus position and look across the field and watch what was the beginning of the summer heat rising over the field. Very interesting. I had the visions at one time there about a huge harbor that looked particularly like the South Seas Islands. I was on board ship. I looked up at this great mountain that rose completely out of the sea with very little beach, and up to a height about maybe 5,000 feet. All wooded area completely up to the peak, and the peak was wooded also. And the interesting thing about all this was the very factor that while sitting there seeing this vision, I was a part of the vision, and I know that it was a part of me. But then I didn't understand until later, many years later in my life, when I was on a ship out in the Pacific. We went right into this harbor, anchored one night, and during the long twilight there, I remember going out to the bridge of the ship and look. Then it went all the way back to this particular time as a youth, sitting there on the porch of my home, practically 3 or 4 years of age, and seeing this vision rise up before me while I was looking out over the field that were beyond the house during the early spring heat that was a part of our life in the South. Now, I want to go on to another point, which shows something about my childhood and my stepmother. My stepmother was very much a woman who was terribly negative. She was constantly being used by the cow power, which I can go back and see now. This is my stepmother that I'm talking about. And she, in raising me, did not want me to have any part of the religious life outside of what she gave me. She didn't want to have anything to do with the way that I could project in those days. And my stepsister could project, and my father, who was also my stepfather, he could do the same thing. And she thought this was the devil's work, and she wanted nothing to do with it. Now, her very consciousness was a consciousness of the lower class people. How my father ever come to marry her. I do not know, but this is a consciousness. She had the mass social consciousness with her. And this mass social consciousness was a separate consciousness altogether from what I had. And what the other two had in the family, because she and my stepbrother were banded together against the three of us. And it was a terrible struggle within this home to know that this sort of things went on constantly. Now, these two consciousnesses, the negative and the spiritual consciousness, are entirely different. And when one looks back at this and sees all of it that's going on, and can look back into their childhood and can separate these consciousness from the parents' consciousness or those that are around themselves, this would be a great enlightenment and a knowingness of the struggle that they went through in order to reach the state that they are now. I look back and I can see that in order to reach the particular state that I am in today, I would have never been able to do so and have the resolution to be the Mahanta today if I hadn't survived this particular period. Everything seemed to be against me while trying to grow up at a very youthful age, or through childhood, rather, because of the fact that everything in the world I tried to do was of no particular use, of no particular purpose to myself or to anyone else. It just seemed that I was a misfit. I was all out of sorts with society. I was all out of sort with the family, except for my stepsister, who seems to have that feeling that here was the one that she had to take care of. And I still look back today and know that this is right. That was her duty within this world, to bring up this child. It was one of the particular things that the Mahanta, or the child who grows into the state of consciousness, must learn. That life is all ek, and ek is all life. And this is one of the things that we must learn about it. It is so fluid that nothing prevents it or keeps it from being that state of ability or the state of living of itself. Thank you for listening.